We are now going to move on to our next discussion, your comments on sex education and whether it should continue to be taught in our schools. 0207 862 2222 is the number for that. Now, Miriam, you told a fringe event at the Tory conference that you would scrap it because it's values-based and not actually knowledge-based. You also said that it put at risk pushing a so-called trans agenda. Tell us a little bit more about what you meant with those comments.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I do think the biology of sex, reproduction, fertility, contraception, and the law should absolutely be taught in schools, although that could easily be done in biology lessons. I used to be a biology teacher, I did it myself. But my concern is with the subject RSHE, which is like a bit like the old PSHE, but relationships, sex and health education, which has sadly become deeply ideological and teaching concepts that were invented 5 minutes ago. Toxic masculinity, gender ideology, things that have not stood the test of time. And in 10 years' time, we'll look back and think, why did we ever teach that? And schools should be knowledge-based. They should be teaching curriculum that's based on fact, that's based on history, that's based on the kind of concepts and understanding and literature that stood the test of time, and not ideas that have been around for 5 minutes. And unfortunately, RSHE, along with citizenship and a number of other subjects, have become about just teaching ideas and ideology. And I don't think that's right. Nobody is an expert in those. Teachers certainly aren't. And we undermine teachers and their authority and their academic status when we ask them to teach things that are just ideas that are trendy today and won't be tomorrow. And I think the more sinister aspect to it is that it's allowed in some quite unsavoury campaign groups to come in and teach children things like gender is fluid. If you don't feel like a boy, you might actually be a girl, all these kind of things. But we've seen the harm that that's done. I just don't think that there's a place for it in schools.
OK, but Miriam, going away from the gender situation, it means if you scrap it in its entirety, then you're scrapping teaching children about healthy relationships, teaching children about what's appropriate, what isn't, about consent, about boundaries. And surely that is fundamentally important for schools to be teaching, because in households where it isn't good, they're not going to be teaching it.
But is an hour a week of RSHE going to change that? No, of course it's not. There isn't consensus in this country anymore about what is and isn't an acceptable sexual relationship. We are a multicultural society with a whole range of different views on sex and relationships and marriage and all those things. And I just question what the value is of teaching a child. For example, I know this is happening in schools, that consent is all that matters in sex. Now, consent is, of course, absolutely important, but of course it isn't all that matters. And the problem is when you ask a teacher who is a geography teacher for the rest of the week, let's say, to start talking about these values-based, very sensitive things that cut across different cultures and different beliefs, to start talking about these things, I don't think that's what schools are for. I don't think parents think that's what schools are for. And I don't think there's any evidence that it helps. Of course, we should be teaching the facts and the law and the biology, absolutely, 100%. But when we get into teaching about values and things that are trendy today and might not be tomorrow, I don't think that's helpful. And I don't think there's any evidence that it helps children.
All right, Miriam, thank you very much for your comments and clearing some of them up. I know you've got to dash off now. Now back to our latest debate, the one we were having just before the break. Should sex ed be banned in schools? Now, the ex-Tory MP, Miriam Cates, who we spoke to earlier, told us why she thinks that it should, but do you agree? Well, you get your calls and we're going to hear from our panel. Henry, sex education, do we need it? Shouldn't it be taught at home?
Yeah, I mean, Miriam Cates seemed to be a bit confused. On the one hand, she said, well, what's the point of one lesson a week, as if it makes no difference. But on the other hand, she sees it as a Trojan horse for trans or other views. And it's not surprising that she made her comments to a fringe meeting of the Tory party conference, because it wouldn't be on the mainstream stage, because it's a throwback to the Victorian values mantra of Margaret Thatcher, you know, Clause 28, etc. And this has no place in the classroom. If you, as teachers, and she said she was a teacher, don't get involved in this, then you abandon children to their own peer group learning, and that can be very, very bad and toxic.
Dangerous.
And then you ignore the rise of social media and all those porn sites, which is where children are getting their views, their ideas about sex, relationships, and some of the terrible consequences and the poor mental health we're seeing as a result. And so we need to firewall children and help them and give them a sense of perspective about relationships, about sex, and about how the two can exist together.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just porn. I mean, you've got the rise of characters like Andrew Tate online, which is causing all sorts of issues with our younger generation. So perhaps it does have a place and it is necessary.
I would say simply this: you hope it will start in the home. You hope all manner of sensible behaviour about how to conduct yourself with other people, respect, be it in a relationship, all those things would start at home. And I appreciate not everybody has it. Now, if you're in certain schools where there are socioeconomic factors where they're coming from families, I always think dysfunctional sounds terribly pejorative. They've not got the kind of secure family unit, yes, but equally, you're then going into a classroom when you've got 25, if you're lucky, 30 sniggering kids, and you're trying to give them very serious life lessons about respect amongst yourselves. And I think the problem is there's a bit of a hodgepodge going on here. I believe that school is a place where you learn literacy, numeracy, and being as part of that school community in the process, how to be an independent person but also function as a team, how to be respectful of your peers. All of those things should be part of the school ethos. Within a lesson, I mean, I do believe that biological sex is something you are born with, and the whole issue of gender fluidity is something that is a whole different minefield. But I think if we're dealing with a facts-based kind of lesson, then that's where you start from. And I think the problem is that these lessons, and I know from my own kids, certainly my younger ones, they come back and it's been a bit of a joke. Not because they don't believe in being respectful to each other, but because of the atmosphere of the classroom, it's very difficult to transmit those very serious issues. Yeah. And certainly when I was at school, it was just a hoot. And I did learn most things from my peers, really. And that's because they got there before my parents got the chance. That's just how things were then. That doesn't mean that it's right. But I think this idea of that there is a possibility for unhelpful, extreme ideologies to creep into the classroom and make it okay is a serious point. And
okay,
I do,
but
because children are
the
quite
question is, to what extent is this
vulnerable.
happening? And if Miriam was still here, I'd say, well, have you sat through these lessons? To what extent? Is it one story in the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, or is this happening wholesale across the country? And my guess is that you might have a couple of examples which have caused a sound and fury and a moral panic because it's been on the front page of a tabloid newspaper, but it's probably not happening.
I think it's more widespread than we think.
We teach religious education in schools, which some people would also say is an absolute minefield, and it's quite complicated to get your head around. We are really undervaluing children's ability to comprehend and think about things if we're just saying it's a complete minefield, don't get them involved in it, don't introduce the concept to them, and don't tell them any information about it.
I don't think the environment itself is suitable. When we talk about religion, we're talking about ideas, and a lot of the things that you learn in school are ideas rather than robust principles. You know, there's a lot of economic theory. There's a lot of theories about history. If you look at any history lesson, you're dealing with political theory. Different groups of people think what's the most favourable way to govern and be governed.
All of that incredibly complicated and difficult to wrap your head around.
And difficult, and you do it in a very robust, systematic and almost formulaic way, hopefully with a very inspirational teacher at the front. But you're then talking about something which is quite personal and intimate, and you have to, literally, it's a cliche, but you have to read the room. And we've had stories. We did a story on Jeremy's programme a week or so ago, in which there was a school where a boy was allowed to identify as a wolf. Okay? Yeah, and our immediate issue is to laugh. Okay? Yeah. We're laughing because he's clearly not a wolf. He's not got whiskers and he doesn't walk around on four legs, but the teacher at that particular school was indulging it.
I even feel guilty for laughing now. Look at that, how far we've come.
Some people might argue, and I think it was Vanessa said, and it was a very interesting point that I hadn't thought of, maybe the fact that he's chosen to be a wolf is a cry for help. He's identifying with that very particular... I don't know, I'm not an expert.
But then again, if you're the teacher, you could break down to the class why he might want to be a wolf. What is it about the wolf that's so appealing?
But they're not qualified. But they are not qualified to get into that very, very difficult area of somebody's personal development.
All right, I just want to take, because we're getting lots of calls on this already, 0207 862 2222 is the number. Christine from West Midlands, do you think we should just scrap sex education completely?
No, hello Storm, hello panel. No, I think for teachers, just basic sex education, reproductive system, male, female, how babies are produced is fine with parents' consent. Because my sort of thought is, a lot of children that go into the classroom, they may come from different cultures whose parents don't want a teacher to tell them anything else but the basics. You know, if they have questions to ask, it may be that the parents would rather tell them themselves than have a teacher who is a stranger to the family, really, giving them so much information and clouding the judgment in their little heads. I think, at 10, 11, especially as young girls can start menstruating at 10 and 11, they do need to know some basic facts about sex.
Of course they do.
But
Christine,
but
Miriam essentially agrees with you. She did clarify that she believes that the biology of sex should absolutely be taught. I suppose there is a concern for children who may live in households where abuse is taking place, where boundaries are not taught, where there's misinformation, and actually being in a situation where a teacher, whether people are laughing in the background or not, sort of explains those concepts, what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate, the ability to say no, all of these sorts of things, consent, that would be incredibly helpful, in fact, invaluable to these children.
It probably would, but then, how much does a teacher isn't a social worker, she's not a sex education expert. I think it's putting far too much pressure on the teachers. If the pupils have got a good enough relationship with their teachers, once that's been taught, the teacher can say, if anybody wants to come to see me afterwards because they don't understand what I've said or they feel they have a problem and they'd like to talk to me about it, well, then that's fine.
But it may be, Christine, they haven't been taught about boundaries, they haven't been taught about certain things, appropriate behaviour, and so they don't know. They think this is just what all families do or what happens in all sorts of families, and so they don't know there's a problem to come forward with yet.
That's true, and let's face it, that kind of behaviour's gone on for centuries. So I don't really know the answer to that. But I think it's not fair to get the teachers so involved with it because that's not what they're there to do. They're there to teach general education.
Sorry, Christine, it's true, but they are in loco parentis, so in place of the parent, and they're with the children through various classes for 8 hours or indeed more per day. And the age of innocence, where children wouldn't know anything about sex until the age of 12, 13, 14, has gone and it's not coming back. And if we retreat, then other characters, you mentioned Andrew Tate, or others, and let's remember, only a week or so ago, the police told us that the category of young people that's reporting the highest incidences of rape and sexual assault are 14-year-old girls. That means there'll be 13 and 12-year-old girls who are being introduced to sex in a very, very poor, very, very bad way at an increasingly young age, so they need to protect them.
Isn't that about what they're being exposed to in terms of online, in terms of all the other things which
and I'm a bulwark against it.
But with the best will in the world, a teacher can stand at the front of the classroom, and I'm picking up Christine's point here, and say, this is right, this is wrong. And we're going beyond talking about what's acceptable standards of behaviour, because the right to say no, all of those things should be wrapped up in respect and behaving in a way that's appropriate to your peers. But they're also being exposed to so much brain rot.
Yeah.
But hold on, what are we talking about, brain rot? Because actually, I think very young children in primary school are having discussions about different family dynamics and different family groups. So there'll be a discussion about who lives in your household. Is it your mummy and daddy and granny and grandpa? What do you call them? Maybe some families have two mummies, maybe some families have two daddies. And having that discussion about families all look different and all of them are okay.
That's the kind of thing that Miriam is dead against.
And isn't that really acceptable and teaches tolerance and respect in our society that we live in?
The problem is that when you're in a kind of homogenous group, some people may not feel comfortable with the fact that there are certain aspects of their background or the privacy of the home that they want to share, or they may feel judged because if say 70% of the class are in a kind of so-called traditional family and they're not, and we're all talking about, well, it's okay because we all accept everything. Children are, I think the fundamental point here is children are vulnerable, they are impressionable, they are not fully formed in terms of the ideas that exist in the world. And I think it is a huge responsibility for school, as you say, in loco parentis for good reasons, but also when you've got a whole class of kids, unless you can pick up the nuances and watch the child who is flinching when you happen to mention that, it's important that you behave in X or certain Y or whatever, and actually that's resonating with them, what are you supposed to do? The responsibility is massive when you go down that road.
Well, the responsibility of teachers is massive. But Sarah from Warwickshire, what's your view on this one?
Hello. Yeah, I think sex education is really valuable for children, particularly when it comes to the LGBT community. Trans people and what Miriam said, have always existed. It's not a trend. But also it gives them a safe place to explore and ask questions that they might not be able to do so at home, or they're confused about if they've seen something on social media.
But Sarah, I mean, I suppose what Miriam's concerned about when we're talking about gender, the trans community, is that talking about it in and of itself will encourage it in some way?
I think exposing children to the fact that trans people exist isn't a bad thing. I don't think it's going to encourage them by telling a 5-year-old, 7-year-old that there are people who exist who don't identify kind of as the gender. That woman isn't going to start putting a boy in a dress or something like that. It just opens their mind, really, that there are people that are different than them. There are people that have different experiences, and that's all valid.
You're shaking your head.
I am shaking my head because we're not dealing with empirical information here. We're dealing with it's anecdote and what we think and what we believe, and that's fine. That's the basis of any interesting discussion. But I think it's a fundamental issue that when children feel unhappy or displaced, or they're not sure of their place in the world, or they feel sort of slightly vulnerable, and somebody says it's okay, have you thought about the fact that you may not be a boy, you may be a girl? And there's all these huge ideas circulating around. And I've heard it and I've seen it where parents have talked about the fact that children have aligned themselves to certain ideologies or ideas because it's replaced something. It's filled a vacuum that existed. That's why you've got to handle this so carefully rather than saying, well, smack that between gym and geography on a Wednesday afternoon and shove it in there.
Sarah, thank you very much for your call. Natalie from Cardiff, what's your thoughts?
Hi. I think there's a place for sex education in schools, but I think there needs to be more of an emphasis on teaching the fact that it's still illegal to have sex until you're 16. And the reason behind that, the fact that the mental and emotional development is needed still up until that age. I think more explaining about your emotions and your mental development is needed.
Do you know, Natalie, is a 7-year-old pregnant lady sitting here, I am nodding away with you, but at the same time, I remember being 16 and thinking, I knew everything, that I knew I was, mentally mature. You think that you're wiser than you are. I don't know, how much do you think the children will take on their teacher saying you're not emotionally mature enough to deal with the outcomes of sex?
No, I appreciate that. Rather than saying you're not emotionally mature enough, it's more teaching how to be emotionally mature, how to be aware of these different emotions and impulses that can occur as you're developing, and the impulses they can bring about on us as young people, and to help us be more in control of them, to be more mature about them, rather than saying they haven't got it, teaching them they got it, but how to be aware of them and how to deal with these emotions.
How to harness it, and also maybe to acknowledge the negative outcomes of it if indeed they have become sexually active prior to that.
Yeah, but also there's this issue of being qualified to do it because, Natalie's talking about this idea of feelings and recognising feelings, and these are all very important. People develop at different ages. They're exposed to different influences at home, as we've said. Now, if you happen to be, and I'm not being dismissive of this, but you happen to be the geography teacher who's been told you need to do this lesson on a Wednesday afternoon, obviously there's going to be some kind of guidance
training,
to that. There will be some kind of training, but they're not psychologists. They're not, and there's a big difference between dealing with factual stuff. Please understand that if you have sex under the age of 16, even if your body is roaring and raging for you to want to do it, it is a criminal offence.
Or if indeed you're 16 and the individual you are having what you think is consensual sex with is 15, you're going to be in big...
Those things are really... Sorry, I beg your pardon, Henry. All I was going to say very quickly is those things are necessary to teach because you need to make people aware that this isn't just like, oh, you're not old enough. There's a legal implication.
But I'm sure that they wouldn't just drag the geography teacher over and say, OK, well, you've got to add this on. They would give some training. My brilliant PE teachers from back in the day in my school...
psychologists, Angela's point.
Maybe, but you don't have to be a full-blown psychologist.
You're dealing with young, vulnerable
of course
minds.
But
you want somebody fully
most
trained
parents
to do
are not
it.
fully trained psychologists, but we're saying...
No, but they have an intuitive connection with their kid because they've got unconditional love and they want the best for them.
But one of the reasons why we send children to formal school is that their parents are not equipped to do certain things like teach maths or English or geography or Spanish. Not possible.
And on that point, we're going to have to move on. Don't forget, though, that later we're going to...